we have on our panel Colleen Thomas, who is my co-chair, and she is also the homeless outreach coordinator for Deschutes County Health Services. Tara Furtado is the chair of our shelter committee and is going to be deeply involved in this winter shelter project. She is also the Next Steps program manager at Bethlehem Inn. I believe we have Dr. Randall Jacobs here, who's chair of the board of directors at Shepherd's House Ministry. Also from Shepherd's House Ministry, Kurt Flosky, who is the executive director there, and John Lodice, who's the director of emergency services. We also have Gwen Weisling, the executive director of Bethlehem Inn, Sherry Helt, state representative from Bend. Scott Cooper from Neighbor Impact had hoped to be able to join us, but he has a conflict that he wasn't able to reschedule. But we do have Molly Heiss, who is the Director of Housing Stabilization at Neighbor Impact. And Patty Wilson is also on board, and she is the Deputy Executive Director of Programs at Neighbor Impact. We were hoping to have Patty Adair, the County Commissioner, but I don't see her yet. Hopefully she'll be able to join us at some point in the meeting. We have also from the county, Eric Kropp, the Deputy County Administrator, and Christy Bollinger, who is the Property Manager for Deschutes County. We also have two officers from the Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Michael Gill and Sergeant Dan Marsh. From the city of Bend, we have Lynn McConnell, who is the Affordable Housing Manager. We are, and I'm not sure from my screen if we, I know we have Keisha Weaver from Bend PD. I don't know if Liz Lawrence is there or not. Yes, she is. I see her now. Sorry.
That's okay.
We also have Stacy Whitty, who is the executive director at REACH. Patty Gaskins, I'm hopeful is here. Yes, there she is, okay. Who is the outreach coordinator at Bend Treatment Center. We have Tammy Bainey, the executive director of COIC, had hoped to join us, but had a family conflict that couldn't be avoided. And that is our panel. So as you can see, we have quite a distinguished group of people, all of whom are involved in community service in a variety of different ways. And I hope we'll all be respectful of them, have a lot of good conversation with them. I'd also like to thank the people at Connect Central Oregon who are running all this behind the scenes. Scott Breeze, the executive director, and Brent Salvador, who's the associate producer for us. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Colleen Thomas to introduce our subject for us.
Thanks, James. And thank you for everybody for being here and sticking with us through the technical difficulties. This is new for us and it's a new brave world in the midst of COVID. So we just are really thankful for all of you for tuning in on Facebook and YouTube, and then for everybody on our panel today. This is a vital conversation for us, not only the Homeless Leadership Coalition, but many community partners in our region and the community, the Bend community at large. So today, we are having this vital conversation in regards to the needs for a Bend warming shelter this upcoming winter season. So Central Oregon's Continuum of Care, the Homeless Leadership Coalition, we have been working very diligently with many community partners, community agencies to identify a location for this upcoming shelter or winter season. The HLC has established a shelter committee that we have had running for the last couple of years. And the purpose of that committee is really to bring different service providers together to meet year round to identify barriers and needs for providing winter shelter for our vulnerable population every year. We have 12 different community agencies that participate in that shelter committee, and we are lucky this year to have Tara Furtado, the Next Step program manager, be the chair of that committee. She brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise in regards to providing shelter, and we just are so thankful to have her help lead us in continuing to have this conversation. So thanks, Tara. So I just want to kind of ground us a little bit and talk about the need and the importance for a shelter. This conversation, not only is it in regards to identifying a location for a winter shelter in the city of Bend, but really want to raise the awareness for need for long-term permanent solutions for those experiencing homelessness in our region. As we know, our year-round shelters in our region often reach capacity when it comes to the winter season. And so being able to provide a winter shelter for those that, one, might not be able to access the winter shelter due to capacity or other reasons, it serves a vital need to relieve the pressure on our year-round shelters. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit more through the panel. But just so we know, and just to highlight, last year, Central Oregon, so the Tri-County region, including the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, served 1,065 unique guests at Warming Shelter. In Bend, out of those 1,065 unique individuals, the Bend Winter Shelter served 327 unique individuals. So again, those are 327 unique individuals that were not accessing our year-round shelter. In Bend, the overnight stays were just under 3,500 unique shelter overnight stays at the Bend Winter Shelter. The Bend Winter Shelter last year was open for 121 nights. As we know, having this conversation and coming back every year is, we don't want to be in this place every year. It's really important for us to have long-term solutions. We know it's not cost effective to continue to look for locations and hire staff and really kind of pull things together last minute. And so it's really important for us to be able to have this conversation and for all of you in the community to be a part of this conversation. Again, I want to just highlight this year's point in time count. We had 969 individuals that identified as experiencing literal homelessness, and that's across the region again, including the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So 969 from our point in time count, but we had 1,065 unique individuals access just winter warming shelters. So again, we see that there's that vital need for winter shelter across our region. We are in this really interesting time of global pandemic of COVID-19. And so we are working continuously with service providers and following OHA and CDC guidelines as we look for a location for warming shelter for the region this upcoming year. So as I mentioned, we don't want to be in this position every year of looking for a different location. We want to be able to start this conversation, bringing community members as we look towards the winter shelter or winter season this year. And it's going to be challenging. It's challenging. We have all seen that in this time, it's a challenging time. And so we continue to work together as community members and just really want to highlight the need for collaboration and communication across agencies, and just really appreciate all of you being a part of this conversation, and that there is a huge need for some of our folks experiencing homelessness across our region. So with all of that being said, I will pass it off. James, is it?
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Colleen.
Yep.
As hopefully most of you know by now, who read our introductory emails, Shepherd's House Ministries has agreed to step up this year and manage a winter shelter for Bend, provided we can find a location and funding is available. And so I'd like to get a little overview of how they're viewing the situation from them. And we'll start off with Kurt Flotsky. And you'll need to unmute. There you go.
There we go. Great. Are there any slides that are going to be up, James?
Yeah. Could we get the slide presentation? And
okay, we can go to the next slide. So first of all, I just want to thank HLC and the community reaching out to us. We're hoping that we can help all of us achieve this goal, which I think is really critical and key. And I think, Colleen, you did a great job of just sharing the need. And it's been an ongoing challenge for these last few years. So I just kind of wanted to give an overview here of some of the things that we are talking about. And we just feel like, introducing ourselves to those that may not know us very well, but our desire is to be able to address the homeless issues that are facing so many of people in our community and our region. Also facing in hunger and substance abuse, physical mental illness, and the domestic violence and trauma that so many of our people that access our services, I know with Bethlehem Inn and many of those that are on the panel today, are dealing with. Currently for us, we're a nonprofit, and we have residential recovery centers for men, women, and children that add up to about 40 people total. And then we do a year-round homeless shelter here in Bend for 25 men on Division Street. We also have been running a winter shelter in Redmond for the last 6 years. And right now we're anticipating the possibility of that number going up, that we'll be serving potentially up to 50. And part of that is the unknown pieces that we're facing into right now with COVID, with potentially the surge. There's a lot of unknowns with the economy, high unemployment. We're not quite sure what's going to happen with folks that are renting, those that are on the edge. So we're anticipating possibly our numbers could go significantly up in Redmond as well. We've also helped with winter shelter startups in Jefferson County. We've now spun that off. It's fully in the hands of the faith-based network up there. And we've also been the fiscal agent at the Sisters Shelter for the last 3-4 years. And then we have two graduate homes for 18 men. And we helped assist at the Sheriff's Office shelter last year. Next slide, please. I think obviously the project is to reopen the Bend Winter Shelter. And then the objectives is, to save lives, to provide a safe place to shelter and sleep. We'd like to see the ability to serve 2 meals, to be able to provide clothing and toiletries. And I think we feel very strongly about wanting to partner with the existing agencies that are represented here in this meeting on substance abuse, mental health, medical, housing, employment, legal, and case management. I think we all know that when people are accessing shelters, they're more likely to consider accessing those services and staying plugged in to some of the really key services that they're maybe already in, such as mental health and dealing with their medical issues. So we feel really strongly that the shelter would have that piece deeply embedded in it. Next, please. Currently, the 2 local shelters, which primarily that's Bethlehem Inn and us, we have been running at capacities during the wintertime. And one of the things that precipitated kind of, us stepping deeper into this whole issue a couple of years ago, when we, 2 winters ago, we found ourselves running over 40 homeless people a night in our facility on Division Street, which is way beyond our capacity and ability. And so we recognized that we were struggling to be able to meet the needs. And I know that so we're Bethlehem Inn with all of the needs as well. So we've all been running at capacities during the winter time. And I think also the 2020 PIT point in time count identified 969 people experiencing homeless. So the increase between 2019 and 2020 has been 10%. And right now, there's just a lot of unknowns as we're facing into the fragile economy and rising unemployment. And what all that means is we're trying to plan through the pandemic and possibly a fall flu surge. Next, please. I think that one of the great benefits is that the shelter can help prevent life-threatening exposure on the streets. I think also that it can be a huge help to first responders, to the police as well, and hopefully being able to reduce some of the crime that is experienced often in homelessness. The medical community is not as taxed, so we're able to access hopefully people like Mosaic and some of the mobile medical, so we're not over accessing the emergency room at St. Charles. And then hopefully the guests may choose to receive the help that's offered, and being able to engage, like I said, more in some of the medical and the mental health, housing and employment, and the legal issues that sometimes folks on the streets face. Next. So I think a couple of the key elements. Number one at the top is identify locations. That's has definitely been a challenge. A few years ago, when we were helping to support the work downtown that Stacy Whitty was doing for women and children, we got together with Stacy, and after that was finished, we looked for almost a year and a half for a location for women and women with children for a low barrier shelter. So at the top of the list, identify location or locations is really a significant challenge. And I think hopefully with all of us together, we can maybe solve that. And we put in location or locations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but some of that has to do with the unknowns of what we face into this fall with COVID and the flu, and then the CDC shelter recommendations when it comes to social distancing and those kind of things. So we recognize there's a very big potential, if we're not able to find a large enough facility to do social distancing, that we may be looking at needing multiple sites. We're going to continue to have to write grants and fundraise, to hire staff and recruit volunteers, and then to coordinate the services with our partner organizations, to train the staff and the volunteers as we move into the shelter time and procure equipment and supplies. We'll establish the meal train, gather statistics and report on the outcomes, and then create financial and grant reports as well, and then process the donations and evaluate the program as we go. Next slide, please. So the facility requirements, which I mentioned, is with no social distancing, we think maybe one facility to house up to 75 men, women, and children. Those are based on some of the numbers that accessed the shelter this last winter. The challenge is social distancing, which in my sense is probably something that we're going to have to face into. I don't see us not having to deal with that. So social distancing with CDC shelter guidelines, we estimate that we either need one large facility or we may need up to 3 facilities to accommodate those anticipated numbers and try to meet the CDC requirements. And so I think that's something that we've got to really, as a community and as leaders, think through. Next. So the timelines for us for the project is the pre-season, which is now through November the 15th, which is to location identity. So finding the facility or facilities, and then the hiring and training of the staff, and then the scheduling of that. During the open seasons through November through the end of March is the shelter operations, statistical and grant reporting, and the budget compliance. And then the postseason is the employee separations, the final grant reports, financial statements, and the program evaluation of how the winter went with the program. Next. And the final program evaluations will be to gather the statistical data, the numbers and the days that we've been open, the meals served, the capacity, met or exceeded, security interactions, our neighborhood interactions, engaging with the medical, fire, and police, first responders to see how it went for them, and then gathering all the statistical data on the guests that is going to be required. And you can kind of see through the list there that we'll have to be paying attention to. Next, please. Might be it. So I think as we sort through all of this, I think we recognize one of the great hurdles is the facility or facilities, and we're concerned about that. I think all of us are. My hope is that as we partner together, we can solve this for our community. And I think as we're working towards the fall, just a lot of the unknowns and the challenges that we're facing with COVID and a possible flu surge, and then the need to do social distancing and try to meet the CDC guidelines for sheltering. So those are the things that we're currently deep in the process of, and know that we need help and we need a partnership in order to raise the funds that are going to be needed for this needed program, and then also finding the shelter or shelter buildings that are going to be necessary.
Thank you, Kurt. Before you mute yourself there, I don't know if you can have you have the answer to this question immediately, but hopefully if you don't, you can get it for us and I'll pass it on later. But
Sure.
Representative Helt was wondering if we had any approximation of the square footage we might need for a building.
I don't have that right off the top of my head for that. If it was one facility, we would need to figure that out for 75, roughly our estimate of 75. Right now, I think the CDC recommendations is they would like to have a minimum of 6 feet separation. I don't know, Colleen, you might be able to help me on that, but I think that's the latest that I've seen. They also are highly recommending barriers if at all possible. And so that would be another issue that we would face into as we look. And you know, the larger the facility, the potential ability to separate and to make distance becomes easier.
Okay. Thank you, and we'll follow up, Sherry, with that information. We also have John Ladise here, and before you get started, I have a question that has come up that you might address as well regarding whether we want to be open every night during the season or just on the coldest nights. And you'd spoken to us before about some of the advantages that you had seen in the Redmond shelter and elsewhere about being open every night. So if you could address that as well.
So the certainty of being open every night, first of all, just being open more nights means we're serving more people and we're serving them across the board all through the winter. Now, we set temperature standards when we're under resource constraints and when we're under budget constraints, but setting a temperature standard it's useful, but it's not the most effective. We have different guests with different vulnerabilities. We can set a temperature standard and then we can have precipitation, and how does that factor into the mix? So when you're just open every night, you eliminate all of that, and you know that you're serving everybody who needs the shelter and comes to your shelter. So that's one, the most effective way to render the service. Two, the certainty of that was greatly preferred, not only by the staff, even though it meant they had to work more, but also by volunteers, because when you're with a temperature standard, you may have volunteers who sign up for certain nights of the week, and they don't know if they're going to be at the shelter that week or not, because they don't know if the shelter is going to be open until you get to that night and the temperature forecast is known. So we found last year, guests started coming earlier and staying longer, and that gave us more consistent service, and it led into some of our best practices that relate to how well we know our guests and what they need and how much they trust us. And it also kept the volunteers much more active and more engaged. And the volunteers enjoyed the shelter much more because they knew when they would be there, they knew it would be open. If they were cooking a meal, they knew it would be served that night, instead of having the shelter closed and then you have to figure out what to do with the meal. So there are all types of negative factors that get taken away when you're open every night. There's two ways to look at the winter shelter. You can look at what do you ideally want to happen when you open your doors on any given night? And then what do you need to make it through the entire winter? Because it is a marathon. Being open every night makes it a marathon for sure, but the certainty of knowing what you're going to be doing every night alleviates that. And you also feel better about the fact that you're really doing the best you can for the people who need the shelter.
Thank you. We have another question here that I think I'm going to direct to Neighbor Impact, either Molly or Patty. You can arm wrestle for who gets to answer it. But we have a question just about the capacity to handle a large volume. And I think if you could speak to how the community of service providers came together last year to deal with things like meals, various types of equipment that were passed out, and just to make things happen that might help someone understand how we'll be able to make this happen, possibly on a larger scale this year, because the need is likely to be larger.
Patty gave me the go ahead. So it was definitely an all hands on deck experience this last winter. The sheriff's office stepped in with a place for us. Shepherd's House and Ben Treatment Center and BI and the Homeless Leadership Board came together to help train our shelter staff really quickly. Neighbor Impact provided some of the infrastructure to hire those staff. The meals were garnered and organized by Stacy Whitty with Reach. She reached out to volunteers and made that happen for us. Just a lot of community support and community investment. Donations started flowing through the HLC and other places. Shepherd's House, if they had too much of something, they'd give it to us. If we had too much of something, we'd give it to them. So just a lot of collaboration and coordination, but it really is a huge undertaking, and keeping the supplies up, and that kind of fell on me. We had some assistance from Oregon Housing Community Services with the Senate bill money that came into our area, and that was shared out with other warming shelters across the region. But supply runs alone, I'm sure John can speak to this, but if you've got showers, which we actually did in the facility we were at, shampoo and conditioner, and you feel like you just purchased that and you turned around and you need it again. So taking care of people is a lot of busy work. It's great work, but the volume is huge, and it does take a village for sure and for certain.
Thank you. I'd just like to acknowledge that we have Commissioner Adair on board, displaying as Christy Bollinger through the magic of technology, but she's welcome under any name. While we're on the subject of last year's winter shelter, I was wondering if Michael, you could comment for the role the sheriff's office played, and some of the good things you saw, and also feel free to comment on some of the challenges we're going to face to do this again this year. And just a reminder to folks, the sheriff's office was able to offer us a space last year because they had a space due for renovation. And between the sheriff's office and Deschutes County, they stepped up and postponed that and made that space available. And that's why we were able to open a winter shelter last year. So Michael, if you could unmute yourself and give us a little bit of your impressions.
All right, I think I clicked the right button. Thanks, James. Hello, everyone. Sergeant Marsh could not be here this morning. Captain Schultz couldn't be here. So it is just me. So I guess the first thing I would say is for the sheriff's office, it was a positive experience. I'm in my 25th year working at the sheriff's office, and having a sheriff that's willing to say, hey, we'll open up some space and we're going to think outside the box and we're going to be a warming shelter this year, and giving us permission to go forth and work with a lot of folks on my screen here. Now, it was a good experience for all of us. So I was happy to be a part of that experience and to collaborate with a lot of great people in this community to make that happen. Honored to work for Sheriff Nelson and his leadership and saying, let's make it happen. Captain Schultz and I got to go to a lot of meetings together and meet with a lot of you and all of our preparation for that. It was very rewarding. Sergeant Marsh, who couldn't be here today, he was my boots on the ground every day. So he stayed in regular communication with HLC and Neighbor Impact, the staff, the volunteers. So he helped to keep those lines of communication going. And I think that was really vital to have as a representative of our office, to have Sergeant Marsh there, staying connected. Each day was a positive thing. We were able to quickly identify any challenges that might be going on and fix that. So that's vital. Had a good relationship with all the HLC, Shepherd's House, Neighbor Impact people. That was important as well. Some challenges, so for us, once we gave up the space, prepared the space, we really tried to stay out of the day-to-day operation of the facility. But some of the things that we saw, there was a few more people that were loitering in the area and didn't want to leave when the shelter closed each morning. But none of that was a major problem. Leaving the shelter each day in the morning, it was dark in the morning, and we did identify that it was, as a lot of staff in the area were coming to work, whether it was at the OSP building, 911, parole and probation, sheriff's office, people who live in the neighborhood adjoining. Sometimes it was hard to see our guests that had been at the shelter. So anything we can do to help them be more visible in the early morning hours when it's still dark out, I think that's important, because we don't want them crossing the street and potentially being at risk. Other than that, the problems I think that we encountered were minor and were easy to address and fix as we were going on. So all in all, it was a good experience for us, and we were happy to help.
All right, thank you very much. I believe Kurt might have actually some numbers on square foot needs. If
yeah, yes, yeah. Thank you, Wendy, my right-hand person. So we had a basic layout, just a kind of idea of a basketball court in your mind. If we were to do social distancing based on a basketball court that's roughly 94 by 50, we figure we could probably get somewhere between 45 and 50 people in there to lay down. That's with 6 feet apart. But keep in mind that means there's no tables. There's that would be strictly just mats on the floor or cots or whatever. So, and they'd be stacked in there very tight, but it would still be able to do 6 feet separation. So somewhere in that 45 to 50 range of people on a kind of a basketball sized court of 94 by 50.
Okay, thank you. We've had a couple comments online, and I encourage people to ask questions there or make comments, and they'll get passed to the panel. But we've had an offer from Family Kitchen to help provide meals this winter if we can get food delivery. So, I mean, that's the type of community support that we need to make this happen. And that's part of the reason for this conversation today, is begin that discussion and get people on board into making this happen, and making it happen in a way that, and I know Shepherd's House feels this strongly, in a way that it can be a good neighbor as well as a success for serving the people who need the service. So if I could go on, Gwen, glad to have you here. I'm wondering if you could just address a little bit the difference that this makes to Bethlehem Inn to have an independent winter warming shelter in Bend, as far as your ability to deliver the services that are part of your mission.
Certainly. Well, we are so grateful for Shepherd's House stepping up, and certainly Neighbor Impact in the past, and Stacy before that, and Sagewood Sanctuary, everyone that is doing everything they can. So we've had a great partnership. The Bethlehem Inn can't operate without all of everyone on the screen and out there and the partners. So in the wintertime, what we do try to do, we have only about 1 or 2 spaces where we can take folks in a warming capacity. And that is, very limited because we are not a low barrier shelter, but we can kind of make some exceptions, but it all is really safety dependent because we have children in the population that we're serving. So what we try and do is, and what we have done successfully, is bring people in as actual residents if we have the space. But as was mentioned earlier, that space is very limited. The nature of our program allows people to come and hopefully successfully find housing anticipating what this year might look like in terms of the affordable housing even being tighter than ever, we are very reliant on having a warming shelter and want to be that resource for 24 hours. So we are in contact and able to, provide additional resources, whether it be the shampoos or clothing and things like that. But we are somewhat limited in terms of the CDC guidelines, in terms of how many people we can have at the shelter now. And I don't think that's going to change much this winter. So the emphasis really is that we want to be as supportive as possible to make sure that this happens so that we can focus on the folks that we're serving here, and hopefully people from the warming shelter can ultimately come here as well.
Thank you. One thing we've mentioned is the way the county stepped up last year and made a building available. And, we have been working with both the county and the city to find property. Last year, we got lucky and there was a suitable space, and the requirements for a building are rather stringent and hard to meet, which is why we're having this meeting. But the city and the county have both stepped up to support us in this effort. And I'm not sure who the right person to ask from the county is, either Eric or Christy. If you could give us a little bit about how you're participating and helping us out, and how we can work with you going forward in the search to try to identify locations and make sure they're appropriate.
I guess I'll start out. First, what we did last year and this year is we looked at our inventory. Luckily, last year the sheriff's office had that space available and was willing to make it work. So kudos to the sheriff's office. We looked at our inventory this year again and don't have any available space. In fact, we're kind of in the opposite mode of the last couple of years. We're looking for space for our own staff that will continue to help out. And Christy can also look at what private spaces or leased space might be available. So we're happy to continue to be at the table, but unfortunately for this year, we don't have a available space.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Now, I wasn't trying to make you come up with a space for us right now, but I did want to acknowledge the work the county has done with us in the past, and that you've continued to be a support. And did you have anything to add to that, Christy, or?
Also commit.
Excuse me. No, I think Eric summed that up very well. We took a deep dive into our inventory and had many conversations with the board. And this year, unfortunately, we don't have the space. And I guess one other thing to add too, as far as our space is concerned, it's COVID has impacted how we manage our buildings and provide space for staff. So that's had an effect on inventory and available space as well.
Thank you.
Also, James, in case Commissioner Dare wants to say anything.
Would you like to chime in there, Patty?
We actually, at our board meeting, said we are more than willing to help if something does come up. If there's a building that we can rent, it sounds like you need at least, to be better, 5,000 square feet. You're talking about a basketball court. So the county commissioners did say we are more than willing to help support that endeavor if we can find something. So just want you to be aware of that it's, we want to continue in the future. Just, we don't personally have anything this year.
Right. And I appreciate that. And last year, a number of us at the HLC toured various county buildings with the commissioners, and we really appreciated that effort. I know the city of Bend has stepped up with some initial possibility of funding through their CDBG grant. And Eric, would you like to talk about how the city's involvement in the process, or dump that on one of the other people that signed in as Eric King?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say at a high level, you know, we want to stand by and help in any way possible. And as mentioned, yes, there is some funding that has been dedicated. I can let Lynn speak to that in more detail. And then we've also reached out to the private market, to the commercial real estate firm Compass Commercial, to help identify some space. I know Shelley Smith, who's on the call as well, has done that. We don't have a inventory of facilities, unfortunately, that are city owned. We're pretty much just, we just house our own staff. We don't have any excess capacity there, but we're more than willing to sort of help. I would also say there's some opportunity this year with some funds that could be available from the CARES Act that came, and some of that has been allocated to the city. The council subcommittee just solidified a broad plan, and we've roughly set aside $1 million to help with vulnerable populations, childcare, housing assistance. We'll be working with our partners at Neighbor Impact and United Way to help distribute some of those funds to where it's needed most. So I think there could be some additional funding opportunities for things like plastic barriers or anything needed to comply with physical distancing requirements. We're more than happy to help with that. But I'll turn it over to Lynn or Shelley if they want to add to that.
So this is Lynn McConnell. Just wanted to say that council did approve the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee's recommendation for a start of $75,000 of CDBG funds to Shepherd's House for the purposes of this winter warming shelter, staffing, and other needs. They also suggested that any additional income that would come into that program through this calendar year would go to Shepherd's House. So if there's an additional, it won't be called the CARES Act next time, but that's where a portion of this money came from, an additional federal action to dedicate money either through the CDBG program or to cities directly, depending. There's some potential there as well. So we're hopeful that that number will be much stronger than 75,000 at the end of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, since we have both Stacy Whitty and Patty Gaskins on the call here, and they were involved with the shelter last year as well, and also are involved in doing outreach in the community to people experiencing homelessness. I'm wondering, let's go with Stacy first, if you can just give us a little idea of the need we have out there that this shelter will help us fill this winter.
Hi, this is Stacy. I know Patty and I are seeing large numbers of people out there that we have never served in services as far as coming into town from Family Kitchen or Ben Methodist. So there are a lot of people in our community that aren't currently accessing services. We saw many of them come into the winter shelter last year. And I think that as we're continuing our outreach, we'll be able to continue to build relationship and build trust to get folks in. There was concern about people coming into the sheriff's department last year. And I think once we had some folks come in, we built up that trust and it worked out really well, but we definitely need to build that capacity. The shelter is critical. Sheltering people is number one, but I agree what John talked about, case management, because that's where we're going to see changes and shifts in people's circumstances. And that is based on trust. And that's when we can get to people in one location. So the need is great. And we are seeing large numbers of folks, China Hat, Juniper Ridge North, and other camps that are popping up all over town.
Thank you. Patty, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, geez, Stace. No, just kidding. You said it all. No, basically, well, yeah, I would actually, one of the things is assessing needs. Like she was saying, you know, assessing needs, providing support and referrals, navigating coordination of care. I mean, they're in need of that because like Stacy was saying, there's a lot that they just don't know what they want at that point, you know, and it's just like, again, building that trust with people that are out there that need support. And that's my huge thing, is just providing the support they need. And knowing that, you know, that you are there to provide them support and whatever they're open with, you know, and if they're willing making those referrals and just navigating coordination of care. So that's one thing that that's something that I care about, and I'll be focused on that and providing the support to our guests for this upcoming shelter, the winter shelter. Yep.
Thank you. We're getting a couple questions about possible alternative types of locations, and I'm not going to ask those specific questions. We will track them and we will look at those possibilities, but I don't want to put any organization group on the spot here right now with addressing a specific location. So if you're commenting on those in the chat box, be aware that we will look at those locations. And if you have suggestions or alternatives, please let us know at the Homeless Leadership Coalition at info@cohomeless.org. And we'd really appreciate hearing from you. I have a question, and I think maybe John Ladis might be the best person to answer this. Just clarifying the difference between no barrier and low barrier. And I believe the shelter we're talking about here is low barrier. So if you could just give us an idea of what that means.
So we describe our warming shelters as low barrier. And what that means is that our priority is getting people out of the cold to save their lives, but we can't be indifferent to safety situations and to that mission itself. So clean and sober is an important baseline. Although it's not an absolute rule, we won't have somebody killed on a really terrible night because they've had something to drink that day. But we have to evaluate people's behavior. Are they unsafe, including for themselves? Are they unsafe in a way that makes other people not want to use the shelter? And then we risk those lives. So we have to perform that balance. That's the overall general question. We have a lot of guidelines that we present to our guests and ask them to cooperate in. And we're intentional about explaining that we do this, not because we want to control them or regulate their behavior so much, but we need to have a shelter with a certain atmosphere, a certain level, not just of safety as in no one's going to get attacked, but safety as in people feel they can come there, get a night's sleep, feel rested the next morning, and it hasn't been an ordeal to be at the shelter. It's been restful so that they're ready to face whatever they need to face the next day. So we have to step into those issues. Most of the time we can address those issues without making somebody leave. I would say 95% or above, we do it that way. Sometimes we do have to ask people to leave when it's clear that they're just unsafe, either in a specific way or in a general way that keeps people from using our shelter. And we can't have that. We can't have people not wanting to come to the shelter because they feel it's too disruptive or unsafe. So that's a general rule of thumb we apply.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads into a kind of natural question that if one of our representatives from the Bend Police Department could answer is just what is the relationship between the police department and the warming shelter? And how does that work for your department? Liz or Keisha? Liz, it looks like.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and address that. I think we've had a really good relationship with our shelters, and especially the community response team, because we like to stop in and check on some of our folks, make sure they're doing okay, getting the services that they need. And we feel a really warm reception with all the shelter managers and staff and volunteer. So we didn't have any issues. I know just what was addressed, maybe some of the people not leaving after the shelter closed in the morning, but we didn't have really a lot of those issues that filtered into town. I think since it was moved from the downtown core area and we were able to establish some rules and everybody followed with those rules that worked at the shelter, I think it worked a lot better for everybody in community.
Thank you. We had a question in the online chat about, what's sort of the deadline for making this happen, having a space and having funding secured. And Wendy from Shepherd's House, who is on Facebook, had made a comment that the best date would be the beginning of October, which would give you about a month or so to prepare for this. But I wondered if Kurt or John could address, I mean, is that a reasonable deadline to be looking at making things happen if we're going to open on November 15th?
If you, by deadline, you mean the latest time that would be effective, I think beginning of October, considering the scope of this and how much we want to bring to bear. And if we're looking that we may have between 50 and 75 individuals, we have to hire and train a staff specifically for that site. I would say that the beginning of October is kind of a drop deadline, but obviously if that's how long it takes to get a facility at all, we have to work with it. The earlier the better would be the answer, but of course this is reality. So yeah, beginning of October is a good deadline, but by deadline, you know, looking at it as the latest time by which we have a building. Because after that, it does start. We saw that last year. There was a very heroic effort to get that shelter open as soon as possible, but everyone acknowledged that it could have gone much better and in a much less stressful way if we had had a little bit more time. And that was just the way the year rolled out last year, and we've learned from it this year, so.
Yeah, and Kurt, I know you had a presentation you made to the city. I was wondering if you have sort of an estimate of what the cost might be. And I, recognizing that not knowing the facility and not knowing if it's 1 or 3 facilities, this is a really unfair question.
Right.
But if you could just give us a range of what type of fundraising we might need.
Yeah. So looking at whether it's 1 facility or potentially 3, our estimates is it could range somewhere between $250,000 to potentially close to $500,000, depending on how many facilities we would need.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here and kind of open it up to the panel. If you have questions that haven't been answered, or if you have a comment you'd like to make, you know, unmute yourself and chime in. And again, everyone be respectful of each other and recognize that I've got a large group here that I'm trying to monitor, but I think not everyone's had a chance to talk and some people may have something to add, so.
I would add that 2 things we really want to avoid are overcrowding within the shelter itself, because that creates a lot of elevated behavior and leads to a lot of stress that can reduce the effectiveness of a lot of our best practices, because we'll be spending more time policing people's basic behavior than we will sitting and engaging with them. The other comment I would make, also we have to be aware not just of overcrowding within the shelter, but what the surrounding area of the shelter looks like, and who are the neighbors, how will they react to a shelter, how do we shepherd our guests in a way that, you know, avoids any problems and that makes our neighborhood feel comfortable with having a shelter there. And we've had to do that in the past. Some churches give us the buffer of a big parking lot in Redmond, some do not, and we have to take special steps to make sure that neighbors do not feel negatively impacted by the fact that we have a shelter there. It helps that in Redmond, they're usually only at the church for a month, and that helps people be more understanding. But you really do have to take a careful look at the surrounding area and make sure that you can set up the shelter in a safe way, because it's a threat to the guests as well as to the neighborhood if there's going to be some type of conflict or some type of bad feelings. I would also add that a common area where people can comfortably sit and engage with each other will greatly increase the effectiveness of the shelter in terms of how we can serve guests in the long term.
Yeah.
If I can just add, this is Randy Jacobs. With the amount of time it will take to introduce the idea of a location to the neighborhood, that October 1 drop dead date seems pretty late in the game to kind of drop in and say to a neighborhood, this is what we're planning. So just to encourage maybe more time to prepare, particularly in preparing the surrounding community. We want to create good neighbors wherever this is.
Yeah, thank you. I think that emphasizes a point that we want to make this successful and we want to be get ourselves into a position of not having to have this conversation every year, we'd like to find a location, or at least set ourselves up to find a location that would serve as a more permanent shelter. John, to get back to you a second, since you mentioned Redmond, you know, one thing I think about the need for a Bend shelter, and we keep saying Bend, 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 but this really is something that serves Central Oregon and other communities. And since you mentioned the Redmond shelter, and I don't know how free you are to talk about it, but I know that there are likely some additional stresses there this year with churches still trying to figure out how they're going to open for their congregation. So is there anything you can address about how our need in Central Oregon or Redmond is going to be more challenging this year?
I think we have a very supportive set of host churches, and the good news is we had a positive experience with all of them last year. They were very engaged. They were very happy that the shelter was there. They wanted to be involved. We have churches that actively and affirmatively support the shelter. The COVID situation, I think, could be a difficulty. We do have one church that sometimes asks us to use classrooms, and that's a conversation we have to work out. Part of the problem is that a lot of churches right now are still in the midst of figuring out how to do their ordinary activities and services in the midst of all this, and they're not quite ready to turn their attention. They don't have the resources yet to turn their attention to how they'll adapt. But in spirit, we have their support. It's just a matter of working out the physical logistics with each of them. I think, Kurt, certainly our capacity is not going to go down. We're going to, 25 will be our standard capacity, 30 would be our emergency capacity. But as Kurt said, we could be in a situation where we have to have 50, and we have, because of everything else that's going on. I would prefer to see that extra 20 if it's a transferable situation, end up in a bigger shelter in Bend. But again, we don't know, and that's not entirely up to us. So the number 50 that Kurt said, I think as long as we're able to have a shelter in the COVID situation and that somehow, force of law doesn't take that away from us, I think that's the number we want to shoot for. But that will be very, very difficult. And again, you'll hear me rallying that Redmond needs more resources if we're in that situation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sherry, I know there was a discussion in our chat box about funding, and I just wonder if you could explain a little bit of that and tell us what the likelihood of actually knowing what funding might be available for winter shelters before winter is.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Thanks for everyone for being here and all of your passion. This is an incredibly important topic for our community, and you all have worked tirelessly on this for many years. So I appreciate all of your hard work and your wisdom around this, and I'm always glad to partner with you. Budgets. Did you have to ask the most difficult question, James? So we are having a budget special session coming up, and I was told it was supposed to be the 10th of August, and now I'm being told that it's moving to the week after. So that has me a little bit nervous that we're not real solid on our date yet of when budgets are coming, but I'm hopeful. The governor said in her press conference on Tuesday that we would have a budget special session at some point in August. And so hopefully we will know what that means. I am also going to advocate again that we move up our funding timeline like we did last year to make sure that the funding was available early. But one thing that I want to do is also appeal to our community that's out there listening to this to say last year, we did not have a warming shelter. And it was, I believe the temperatures were 11 and 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and we still did not have a location or a shelter. And it was really heartbreaking for every one of us that were trying to get that done. So I would urge any of our state agencies, our federal agencies that have extra buildings to really be looking at what they're using those buildings for, people with extra commercial buildings through this COVID crisis to see if we can think outside of the box. but we desperately need a location, and we need it soon, because it was really heartbreaking to think about people not having a warm place to go when it was 11 and 12 degrees outside last year, despite all of this group's effort of trying to get that to happen. So I'm hopeful. I'm really excited that we're talking about this earlier this year. So thank you to everyone for bringing this conversation earlier. But please, in the community, be thinking about how you can help and what you can do with extra space and buildings so that we can get this done in a timely manner. And I will keep you all updated on the budget conversation as that goes, but I will be sending an email today to ask for this to be fast-tracked again, as it was last year.
Thank you. And if I can put you on the spot again, as long as we have you.
Sure.
And I can't remember what the bill number ended up, but the ability to site a shelter with some more flexibility is something that passed in the special session, but there was a 90-day limit. And I was talking with Lynn McConnell the other day about the difficulty of actually, we're not talking necessarily for the winter shelter this year, but this is the difficulty of coming up with a proposal that meets that 90 days. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think Bend has been one of the few cities that have been saying we need a longer time frame for that. Is that something that's going to be considered?
So in the special session that was 4012, I was able to amend that because many of you are working on the Veterans Village with me to get a more stable location for veterans to get them really wraparound services and move forward. So we added the word veterans to that so that we could use the Veterans Village to make sure that we were able to get those building codes changed for that so they wouldn't have to be our regular strict building codes. And the 90 days is, I'm told, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here, I'm told it's doable. Is that correct? That it can be done. It may be challenging. So if we need to change that, I would love for you all to let me know what the time frame is that we need, and I can try and put in an amendment to change that. But we did work on the time frame and get some intent on the language to make sure that we were able to work with the language. So I amended that bill twice to make it work for Bend, and I was told that we landed in a space that works.
Yeah, and that I can't address the Veterans Village, but we have a number of people who are starting to come forward with other proposals. But as you know from the Veterans Village, to do something, do it right, takes a while, and some of those other things aren't going to be able to happen in that time frame. So if there's a possibility of, maybe we can talk about this later, but just extending that time frame, it might be possible to have other programs in Central Oregon become possible.
Yeah, and to my knowledge, James, it's not an inhibitor for anybody. It just makes it tighter, but we do want to get those up and running as soon as possible because there is a great need. So there's a hard balance between making it too long and making it too short. And so that's the real tough spot, is when we're talking homeless, we're talking great needs and immediate needs. And so trying to really make sure that we do that urgently, but also thoughtfully and in a timeline that doesn't inhibit it. So if you have any projects that are being inhibited by it, please let me know.
Okay. Yeah, and I know I promised not to put people ask gotcha questions or put them on the spot too much, but you're a politician, so you have to expect that, I suppose. So thank you for your answers.
I'm ready for it. And if you have any other hotter questions, I'm ready for those too.
I'm checking here. Give me just a moment. What other questions we might have and make sure I didn't miss anything. Is there anybody on the panel who would like to add another comment or has another question? Because if not, I think we can start wrapping up. We definitely want to keep it to our allotted hour and a half, if not even a couple of minutes short or so. Anyone else?
James, I just want to come back to circle back around to our shelter committee group, and that we are continuing to meet. And as we ramp up, looking, even though it's going to be 105 degrees here in Bend today, is to really think about what this winter season is going to look like. And so we have several community partners and agencies that are at the table to be able to strategize and work together to look at all the different scenarios that could come to play. So again, welcome, community feedback or suggestions in regards to locations and things, and we'll bring that to the committee to really kind of suss those out. And because we know that we want to think strategically and creatively to ensure that we do have this resource for our most vulnerable community members. And, to come back to some of the other questions and things that folks have come up with, and we work as that committee to come up with a guest agreement to make sure that guests are adhering to recommendations, and to the funding side of things too, that certain funding comes with certain restrictions. I know last year with the money that we received, it was a low barrier shelter approach. And so there were certain mandates that we had to meet to be able to align with the funding. And so that committee really looks at all of those factors and comes up and strategizes together to make sure that all areas are being addressed, and that there's a streamlined approach. And again, we're looking at our region. So looking at the Tri-County, especially the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs as well. And that's really what the HLC role is to make sure that we are streamlined and working together to have this resource for our most vulnerable. So just wanted to highlight that as we continue this work.
James, this is Randy Jacobs.
Yes.
May I ask those who might know, who makes decisions about utilization of the Deschutes County Fairgrounds? Where does that responsibility and authority sit?
I could answer that question. It's a department of the Deschutes County, so it's the Deschutes County Board of County Commissioners, and then also there is a fair board and a fair association as well that also would have input.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, I'm going to go ahead and start to wrap this up. But once again, I want to thank this panel. Coincidentally, yesterday I was talking to an assistant city manager of another city in Oregon about a project that they'd managed to get off the ground. And the remarkable thing about it was that it required the cooperation of the county, the city, the police department, the health department, service providers, and so many groups. And the thing that excites me about this today is we have that at the table right now. I think the one thing that, as I look at the panel, and I regret not adding a couple people to represent the business community and the people who may actually have the buildings we need, but that's my oversight, and it's a recognition of, as the Homeless Leadership Coalition, we can be very focused on the mission of helping people experiencing homelessness, and we're not really that adept at some of the other niceties that go along with bringing all these people together and making something happen. So I just want to thank you all for being at the table, and I know we're going to continue to work together. This is the beginning of the discussion, not the end. And thank you, and thank you everyone who tuned in on Facebook and YouTube. And we'll be talking more about this soon, I'm sure. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.